Welcome to this special podcast series sponsored by the Institute for Black Church Studies at BSK Theological Seminary. This podcast series titled Hope on Fire, Black Lives, Eschatology, and the Gospel. I'm looking forward to having conversations with church and community leaders across the region and country around my new book titled The Gospel Beyond the Grave Toward a Black Theology of Hope. And so the first thing I want to do is define this big word that I'll be throwing around in this conversation and conversations I'm looking forward to having all over the country, and that is the word eschatology. What is eschatology? Well, on page 79 of my new book, right at the beginning of chapter 4, I write, eschatology is the study of last things. It explores issues such as death, the intermediate state, judgment, and the eternal fate of all persons. This ambitious branch of Christian theology attempts to think concretely, and I would also add imaginatively, about realities beyond life, heaven, hell, purgatory, and the final judgment. Now, when we're talking about eschatology, no person can give a complete or exact picture of the afterlife or eternity. Rather, we're just simply pointing towards the hope, promise, and future fulfillment of God's purposes. So it's in that spirit I set out to write this book that I hope will provide the church a vision of hope beyond the sort of theological and the racial impasse of our current moment. So I'm looking forward to being able to engage with some wonderful colleagues I have here in the city of Louisville at BSK Theological Seminary and Simmons College of Kentucky, one of our wonderful peer institutions. I've got Dr. J. Peabody Smith and Dr. Chad White from BSK and Simmons, as well as my good friend, Dr. Candace Smith from BSK. And let me give you a good softball question that you can go on and knock out the park. And it's almost the elephant in the room question. Is eschatology relevant for the Black church?
Yes, it is relevant. My hesitation, I think, though, is how it's been presented. It's the idea of hope and heaven and roads made of gold and all of these wonderful, wonderful things, which I believe in. But getting from here to there has been such a struggle and continues to be a struggle.
Yes.
It's we're looking forward to it, but it shouldn't have to be so far away.
Yeah.
I guess is what I'm saying. And if you think about the way that we talk about it or interact about it, we're often talking about when we get to heaven, as opposed to everything that happens between there, here, and now.
Yeah.
Right? Because of Jesus, we have eternal life, everlasting life that's supposed to start right now. But it doesn't often feel that way. Right? So I think it's very relevant. I just wish there's something in between that we could understand a little bit more.
Yeah, I love that. And Chad, before you jump in, one of the interesting aspects of my story, because, it took me 20 years to write the book, is to think about the experience I had being a part of the Black church, growing up in the Black church, being a minister, a pastor in the Black church, where eschatology was important, but then moving more into the academy and engaging with Black and womanist theologians and Black and womanist theology, and the pushback on doing that so that we can, focus on these issues in the here and now. It's always been interesting to sort of see that divide. And as someone who has been a part of 2 Black Church Studies programs and trying to make sure that there are bridges between the academy and the church, that we continue to be in dialogue about these issues, because a lot of folks in Black churches aren't reading and engaging Black and womanist theology. And so Black and womanist theology just can't be for the white church.
Sure.
It needs to be speaking to the Black church and to, the lived experiences of Black people, which is why I just think the whole relevance issue on eschatology is important. Chad, what do you think about some of these issues?
Certainly. I think that the study of eschatology and the embodiment of eschatology is essential, first of all, because it's a biblical principle. No doubt, the book of Revelation being primary source of New Testament for our understanding of eschatology and end times is germane to our everyday life, but much like Dr. Peabody Smith, I think that the issue is how is this presented. Unfortunately, eschatology has been presented in primarily, well, I would say in the majority of space, not only Black churches, but even in our white counterparts and colleagues, as a wait and seeism. Just wait, it's going to get better. Just wait till we get to heaven. When we get to heaven, we're going to do this. When we get to heaven, we're going to do that. And again, Jesus says, "I've come that you may have life and life more abundantly," and not down the line, not next week, but that transformation of our eternal destiny does not only end in heaven, but it starts on earth. And what does that mean to have an abundant life in the context of our relationship with Jesus Christ? And so, no doubt, it's about power dynamics. So, if I control the narrative, I want you to wait until you die to get to this, as opposed to experiencing right now. So I think it's it's about who controls the narrative, who controls the literature, and so I'm greatly appreciative of the work that you're doing in the theological enterprise that helps to open our eyes in a broader sense to what eschatology is really about and how that really looks. Dr. King says in talking about this wait and seeism, he says, I don't want to wait to get to heaven to get a new suit, a new car. I want to get that while I'm here on earth. And so I think we have to have that type of determination when opposing systems and structures that prohibit and prevent people who are oppressed and marginalized, and in the words of Thurman, pushed to the margins of society, those whose backs are against the wall. Yeah. That we don't allow the concept of eschatology being only for when we die, this fullness of life, this ability to engage in all of what life offers here on earth, that we don't allow that to cause us to just wait and be okay with it, that Jesus will fix it by and by. And so I have no responsibility in my self-agency to change not only my personal situation, but societal structures that continue to prevent people of color, primarily women, other minorities, our gay brothers and sisters from having a fulfilled life.
Yeah. I really love this, the point that you both made about some of the disconnect with an understanding of eschatology as always being futuristic, like when we get to heaven. I know I sort of gave my definition I pulled from my book, that, when you're talking about eschatology, death, you're talking about afterlife, eternity, but you're also talking about the inbreaking of God in human history.
Absolutely.
So we're talking about what God did when Jesus came, and sort of disrupted this, course that humanity was on. And so the New Testament climax is the promise of this sort of second inbreaking that's going to permanently, sort of make all that has been wrong right. So eschatology is helping the church to think about what God is doing between this initial inbreaking and this final inbreaking, that is to come. So one of the reasons eschatology is so important, I think, to the Black church is that it's not just when we get there. That the problem the American church has is I don't think we understand eschatology. That I think there's more to eschatology than the pie in the sky and the sweet by and by. That I think if we have this vision of what the end is supposed to be and is going to be, that does put pressure on us to be about that in the here and now. And so, one of the reasons I wrote the book is because I was like, I'm not sure we really understand eschatology, because there's no way you can have a social project of slavery, of racism, the kind of capitalism we have in this country, the systems of mass incarceration and redlining, and you are taking the eschaton seriously. So what do you think? Is there more to eschatology than that? Because sometimes that's all that you might hear in the Black church, or you hear our white sisters and brothers that, God's going to make everything right, in the future, but they don't feel any pressure because the eschaton actually reaches back into the present to empower. It's a divine call to be about that work in the here and the now. And so to me, there's more to eschatology than pie in the sky and the sweet by and by. But, would love to kind of get your opinion on it. Do you think there's more to eschatology than just that?
Well, let me ask this first. Who is the they that we're talking about? When we say they see later on over there, but not the racism, the capitalism, the things that are going on here. So dare I say, I think, in the Black church, we have had so much suffering, so much disappointment, that sometimes all we can think about
Yeah.
is heaven and what, this can't be it, right? And then it's injustice is allowed to be so prevalent. So I would kind of play angel's advocate and say that they are those people that do that oppress, that use the name of God in ways that are unjust, that those are the ones that have this whole idea wrong.
I like it.
I think. I mean, and I think we need to pivot back to your question at some point. But I think Dr. Peabody Smith brings up a great point, because although we are looking at this through a contemporary lens, what did our foreparents and even those in our current context that don't have as much agency as we do have, that does not have as much access to power and resources that we have, how does an eschatology of God is going to fix it help them to deal with their everyday struggles in light of being powerless? Most of us at the table, we can make a phone call or two and get in touch with the mayor. We can make a phone call or two, and put our hands on a couple of $1,000. But what about those who don't do that? And heaven is all they have to hold on to. And so I think that that's a relevant and germane point that also must be fleshed out as well.
No, I think you're spot on, and we'll go back to that question. I really think, and I hope that what this project is an invitation to get out of the binary, that we must only focus on this work we're doing here, and we don't need to be talking about that,
right.
Or, that's all we're going to talk about is the future,
Sure.
to the demise of the work we're doing. I'm like, we can do both.
Sure.
Okay.
Both.
Why can't Black people do both?
Right.
Why does eschatology have to, why do we have to always use that lens that it's something that's going to distract us from the here and now? Because in this, we're going to, get into this issue. Black people are suffering and dying.
Sure.
And for them to not have a holistic vision that this is not all God has for them.
Sure.
a life of struggle, a life of discrimination, a life of imprisonment, of disenfranchisement. Yeah, we're called to fight, to resist, to protest. But, you know, one of the most difficult things about this book was having to read accounts of lynchings.
Sure.
You know, it was, and trying to make theological sense of a culture that's lynching black people. And it was always so gripping to read accounts, to hear people who knew they were getting ready to get lynched praying to God for deliverance.
Wow.
That prayer didn't get answered.
Wow.
They were brutally lynched, sometimes on the grounds of churches.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
And so that can't be the be-all, end-all of meaning for that person's life.
Sure.
And it can't just be, well, they're going to go to heaven. I think there's a lot more we have to think about.
Sure.
And so,
I think that's the importance of the book, because I don't know that we've been forced to kind of think about it in a different way until the reading of the book. How do we deal with that anger, that feeling of injustice? What makes it okay that we're, you know, it's like we all go to, well, we all, what's this song? We all go to heaven or whatever. It's like, come on now, really? You know, and so I think this is probably going to open up a bunch of conversations that people have thought about but haven't really had permission to speak about.
I like that.
Certainly. You know, and the kingdom of God is present yet to come. What does that really mean, and how does that look? And so if it's present and yet to come, there has to be some connection between the present and yet to come kingdom. And how does that look as it relates to justice and the equitable and just treatment of all of humanity? But I think that this whole piece of eschatology, again, because the narrative has been controlled by the dominant culture, the teaching on eschatology, there was not a lot of stuff written by oppressed people about eschatology, because we was trying to survive.
Yeah.
We didn't have the time to sit back and write, these wonderful things. And so I think the challenge that you're proffering now is to say, let's really dig into this whole piece of eschatology and understand that it's not just for tomorrow, and that the book of Revelation is all about resistance. It's about how God wants the world to look, and that we are in divine collaboration with God to make the world look like the kingdom of God. And again, what does that mean? So I think that for me, growing up in the traditional Black Baptist church, being a son of a pastor, fourth generation minister. I mean, I was almost born in the church. I mean, literally.
Born on the pew.
On the pew, yeah.
Born on the pew.
I literally was, man. But it was eschatology was used as a salve, as an opiate to help us to numb the effects of poverty, of medical apartheid, of redlining, of housing insufficiency, of mental health issues when we didn't even know to go to a psychologist because we were afraid of what the nomenclature we would receive, and so using Revelation as resistance instead of apocalyptic, I believe, is the pivot that has to happen. So Revelation is not about interpreting numbers. It's not about, all these wonderful prophecies. It's about resisting Rome and showing that through John the Revelator that God has the last word. Yes. That what is not going to always be. And we have to partner with God to topple these empires and these earthly kingdoms that are contrary and antithetical to what God says the kingdom of God is going to be.
Doc, I'm like, did he read my book? I think, because I talk about, as a New Testament scholar, apocalypticism.
Yeah, sure.
And how the church kind of got away from that. From the sort of Second Temple era, and these early Christian communities had an apocalyptic understanding of the world. And somehow eschatology sort of evolved away from that and kind of became just something that's futuristic, versus apocalypticism gives you the ability to critique and resist what is going on in the contemporary to have hope that there is going to be a better future, and that because of this inbreaking, it's almost a new point of orientation for who we are. And you get confidence, a sense of somebodyness, knowing the world says you're nothing, that it's okay to treat you this way. But a world system that does that is under divine judgment. Sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes.
And, and to think about looking at the American project through an apocalyptic lens,
Wow.
I think gives black people, and Black theology talks about somebodyness. The eschatology ought to give black people that as well.
Sure.
That it's like, no, we're somebody, and God is working with us to resist this. And this system is coming to an end, and everyone associated with evil and injustice, there is going to be a reckoning for these things.
Sure.
So probably one of the most radical ideas in my book is that white Christians, there's going to be a reckoning for slavery and racism.
Sure. Sure.
That you can be saved, but that salvation is bigger than the forgiveness of sins. That Jesus is going to reconcile all things in heaven and in earth. So this is coming from Ephesians and Colossians. It's a different vision of salvation.
Sure.
Salvation isn't just, I got my personal slate clean, because that really absolves them
Absolutely.
from having to do anything substantive with what has been done to their black brothers and sisters. But if salvation has this reconciliatory arc that's not positional in nature, we're reconciled in Christ based on what Christ has done. Yes, but we're talking about actual reconciliation. Okay, that we're not ready for a holy God. We're not ready for the banquet table. So 20 years ago, I read a Catholic theologian, Christopher Pramik, that wrote an article arguing that racial reconciliation was going to happen in purgatory. And so as a Protestant, I was just like, we don't have anything in our theology to imagine a moment. We either get reconciliation here, which we ain't never seen, okay? And we can't look back in the history of the United States and see where justice has been done that provides an opportunity for us to truly experience reconciliation. Or we just have God ignoring everything that's happened to black people. And somehow, even though we can't live together, worship God together here, we're going to all go to heaven and somehow be together. So Pramik's article was in the back of my mind for years, trying to, think through that.
That doesn't even feel just. And God is such a just God.
Exactly.
Sure.
Right.
In my critical race theory, Lynn says that racial reconciliation won't happen here on earth. I don't know how it's going to look, but that's a harsh truth.
That's one of the things I take up in the book. That what I was surprised to find is that there are some Protestants who are starting to lean into the doctrine of purgatory, not to adopt it, but to say this gives us theological material to think in a more complex way about what happens between the point we die and the future when God's going to make everything new.
Wow.
And so purgatory becomes one of the ways so let's say within Catholicism, that they deal with the remnants of sin. In other words, heaven is a place of pure holiness. Nothing that's impure can enter.
Sure.
Right.
So they can no more take all the racial garbage that they've harbored and refuse to confess and even acknowledge that's a problem. How can they stand before a holy God?
But Doc, I don't remember who. I don't know if somebody shared this with me. I don't know if it was H.B.G. Hicks or Thurman or somebody, they quoted them at a conversation we're having and said, is the God or was the God of the enslaver on top of the ship the same God as the God of the enslaved at the bottom of the ship? And so I think all of this stems from what is our understanding of God. You have it in your notes about theology. What is our understanding of God in our God talk? And so if my understanding of God is that God is okay with me commodifying human bodies for my personal gain and creating systems that keep them in perpetual enslavement, even though their bodies may be free. Now we create convict leasing. Now we create prison industrial system and monetize the enslavement of black and brown bodies. If the God I serve and my understanding of the God of the Bible is okay with that, then I see no need to even just have these conversations, and heaven will be all right. And we go back to enslavement about, do slaves have souls? Should they be preached the gospel? Can they be baptized? And if they become Christians, are they literally our brothers and sisters in Christ? No, we got to wait till they get to heaven for them really to be our brothers and sisters in Christ. And so the goalpost continues to be moved around these conversations in a theological enterprise of what this value, not only from an anatomical structure, but even from a spiritual perspective of what the black body and soul is really worth.
Man, that's so good. I mean, so let me just give a couple of the titles of the chapters of my book. So the first chapter is The Crisis of Racism and Idolatry. And in that chapter, I was driving Jeremiah Wright back to the airport. I had him down here in Louisville for a Black Church Studies consultation, and it was a fantastic 2 days. And, as we were driving back, he said, I want to ask you a question, Dr. Brogdon. He said, and I want you to think about it. He said, and when you come up with an answer, I want you to write about it. Now, I don't know if he was really as serious, but I really took that to heart. And his question was this: were the slaves worshiping the same God as their masters?
Yep, that's what it was. Jeremiah Wright, somebody quoted.
Yep. Were the slaves worshiping the same God as their masters? And it takes some real chewing, because Thurman, in Jesus and the Disinherited,
Sure.
was asking, why is Christianity so almost impotent when it comes to the color line?
Sure.
He said, is it how we practice the religion, or is it the religion itself? And what we want to do knee-jerk, because we love the Christian tradition, we want to say they're not practicing the faith right. They're misrepresenting, they're blaspheming. There's nothing wrong with Christianity. But the harder question is to get at the deeper religious thing. And so idolatry becomes a way that if your religion is idolatrous, then it can justify these horrible things. But is it the task of Black theology to just deconstruct, to indict? Because I went back to 19th century Black religious thought, where you have folks like Douglas saying the Christianity of Christ and the Christianity of this land are two completely different things. Okay, one is the real thing and one is heretical, is wrong. And I stand in that tradition. But the reason this is an eschatological project is that I don't want to give up on the fact that God cannot redeem this history. But in order for God to redeem it, we have to expand our theology to go beyond the grave. That it cannot, it's not all happening in history. So it provides an opening to start talking about this intermediate state, where within Catholicism they have purgatory. And I was trying to find an African term for what this place could be, because it would have really worked. But I think, in a sense, it's best for it to not have a sort of set place, because then that becomes the thing everyone's arguing against. And you started going back to gospel music and Negro spirituals and listen to how Black people talk about the other side. It doesn't fit the forensic, transactional understanding of salvation that you hear in the world of white evangelicalism. That they're talking about putting on their robe and telling the story how they made it over. Now, of course, Christ has made that possible, but they're starting to talk about the other side in ways that provide space for them to have things like voice.
Yeah.
And if you have black people telling their story, what are they talking about? They're talking about slavery. They're talking about lynching. They're talking, they're talking about what happened and what the gospel enabled them to survive, to resist, and to finally overcome. Well, if they're telling that story, they're obviously telling that story to someone, someone's.
Sure.
So that, when you have spirituals talking about shaking hands with every person, that's an image of reconciliation.
Sure.
But that's not happening here, and we also don't have I don't believe it's healthy to have a theology where then all of this gets ignored. So we do need some kind of space in this intermediate interim period for these things to continue to be worked through. And I believe there are texts in the New Testament that point to that, that we haven't given as much attention to, like in Revelation, where there's these altar of martyrs who are crying out for justice, and they're told to wait. So even in this interim period, there are people who say, we've been done wrong. And the angel's like, we know.
Sure.
Wait, broader things are sort of playing themselves out. So that then does put a particular, it puts our white sisters, our white Christian sisters and brothers, this is a kind of project that's going to be hard for them to hear.
Sure.
That there is going to be some reckoning for these things, and if they don't want to listen now, they are going to have to listen.
Sure.
Right.
And there's not going to be the immediate reward that they're hearing their churches telling them about. That they're going to have to confront this stuff. Now they can do it now, or they can do it then. They can listen to us now, or they can listen to us then.
It almost gives new meaning to every knee shall bow.
Yeah, he that hath ears.
Because God is not going to be mocked.
Right.
Okay, you can put this theological system together where you can enslave, you can enjoy all these privileges. Every time God raises up prophets to try to correct these things, you don't listen. So go back to the story of the rich man and Lazarus, where he's just callous and insensitive to the plight of Lazarus. And this is an early Christian writing. The person's in hell not because he didn't ask Jesus into his heart. The person's in hell because of his neglect of someone who was in need. Now that's a lens you don't hear in our churches.
Oh yeah.
They say as long as you get the right transaction, if you're in the right church, you're saved. Well, there's a gospel writing that says if you're not taking care of people who are vulnerable, you're going to be in trouble.
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay. So
It's like every person that says they're a Christian might not be a Christian. I mean, I can say I'm a millionaire. I'm not. It doesn't make it true, but I can sure act like one.
Sure, absolutely.
Or speak like one. And I think that's what's happening now is that I don't think that people really understand the true depth of what it means to be a Christian.
yes, absolutely.
Because if you did, then some of the things that are happening just would not be happening.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep. Yeah, which goes back to if you understood eschatology,
Sure.
you kind of wouldn't be going.
Yeah.
Like 89% of Americans are opposed to reparations for Black Americans, and it's a dated statistic, but I don't think. I think it'll be pretty close to it if you were to poll most white Americans. Are they for or against reparations? Most of them are going to be against it. Now, if they thought of their Black sisters and brothers as their neighbors, if they thought in terms of how the New Testament talks about our relationship to each other, that number ought to be the complete opposite.
Sure, absolutely. Okay. I had an interesting conversation with Aubrey Hendricks from Columbia, and Aubrey, Dr. Hendricks argues that for him, Matthew 25 is the litmus test for salvation, not John 3:16.
Yeah,
and he argues that anybody, and not to belittle even my personal foundational theological training, but he says anybody can confess and believe. That takes nothing away from you to transform yourself personally or your community. But he says that Matthew 25, Jesus makes it clear that because I was hungry, I was in jail, I was marginalized, I was oppressed, I was homeless, and you did none of this stuff. He says, so how do we reconcile Matthew 25 with John 3:16? He says in the Matthew 25 is a much more pragmatic and practical aspect of salvation as opposed to accepting, believing, and confessing. And so I think, again, those conversations have to be had. And because the dominant culture controls the narrative so often, that those texts that challenge, the non-responsibility of of communal transformation, those texts don't get highlighted or preached very often because now I have to change. If I'm preaching this text to a church of people that are in power, now they have to change not only their belief, but now their behavior has to change.
Yep. Because eschatology, ethics, ethics matter. People's lives matter.
And that's kind of where I go back to the idea of just because you say you're a Christian,
Right.
3:16, but you're not doing.
Yep.
It's like how does that even work? How can you say that you're a Christian, but you don't do the things that God has asked us to do in helping and serving God's children? That just that baffles me. And I think since I am pastoral care and counseling, I have to often sit before people who have this struggle of this is getting hard. Being a Christian or waiting for something to happen. And I consider myself to be very much like a social justice preacher, and the idea of taking anger that you're feeling and turning it into some type of advocacy. And that's the best that I can offer.
Sure.
Right? I wish there was more, but to do something with that energy. But you kind of need both sides to play ball, and that's the tough part.
Sure.
And not to say that there's nobody willing, it's just nowhere nearly enough.
Sure. And I want to go back to what you asked about, Black theology and eschatology. Should it be about deconstructing or about providing, and you didn't use these words, providing a blueprint or some type of paradigm for moving in the future and changing, community. And I think that it has to do both, unfortunately.
Yes.
We don't have the privilege of not deconstructing because we've been from 1619, we've had preachers, be they white or black, that were, doing, in the words of Dr. Theron Williams, black church and white theology, reminding us and telling us of that we were born to be slaves. We were cursed with the curse of Ham, and that this is God's will, and we have to obey authorities that are over us. And so there has to be some deconstructing because, again, on Sunday mornings, even in 2025, we still are hearing white theology in black spaces. Yeah. So the deconstruction has to take place. Even in our families, we hear, we have people saying crazy stuff. That I'm like, where did you get that from? That's not in the, I don't know what Bible you got that out of, but that ain't the way that works, And so the work of deconstruction still, unfortunately, has to take place.
Yeah.
But we got to chew gum and walk at the same time, while also proffering a blueprint of how we can move forward and what eschatology looks like, not only in the sweet by and by, but in the nasty now and now.
Yeah. And that's why, for those of you who are listening, you should get my book, The Gospel Beyond the Grave, because it is doing both. It's deconstructive and constructive work. It's unpacking the nature of the crisis, the problem that we're in, but it's then giving us a constructive lens to take up work here. Like, for example, chapter 3, I talk about hell on earth. As the reign of injustice. That it's interesting, the most foreboding, terrifying image in the Bible is hell. And to have people describing their world as hell. And for the church to not pay attention to that, to think, well, that's just a slang term, it's popular language. No, that is talking about reality. That's talking about suffering. That's talking about death in ways that we ought to be paying attention to. And so that's eschatological language that's giving theological meaning to the nature of the world. That's something that can help us. I talk about, how Dr. King used eschatology, particularly not only are there some eschatological themes he was alluding to with his I Have a Dream speech that was informing the work he was doing here. But when he was in Memphis the night before his assassination and he knew he was going to die, that he was able to look death in the face, and he said, I'm happy tonight. And that wasn't just some expression. Like, there is something in the Black religious tradition. There is this power that we tap into, that we experience, that allows us to stand up, to look suffering, to look injustice, to look even death in the face, and to not let that define us. That's because he understood this is not all there is. And I've been faithful. I've done what I'm supposed to do. And man, I get goosebumps every time I listen to the end of that speech. And so sometimes when I hear people say, "Oh, we don't need eschatology," I'm like, no, we do, because eschatology can help us do both.
Sure. It
gives us this powerful vision of the future that's very disruptive for our present. It means we've got some hard decisions to make if God's future looks like this. But I love what you said, because you talk about some of the conversations when you hear people say things. Man, when I go to funerals in the Black community, and like the worst sermons I've ever heard in my life, they are always at funerals, because I think we have a difficult time making sense of suffering and death. So sometimes we can fall back on anecdotal stuff, but I mean, I've seen ministers struggling to find words to provide hope and meaning. And so I just wish y'all, you all are the experts. How do Black folks make sense of suffering and death? What have you seen?
How do we make sense of it?
Yeah. 'Cause, I mean, our grief can be very complicated.
How do we make... I mean, I honestly am not sure. When I'm sitting with somebody, my goal is not necessarily to make sense of it, because I don't even know that I can.
Yeah.
But to abide with them while we're trying to think and reconcile it all out. I mean, the hard part, and this might just be my limited world as a counselor, I hear so much suffering. And some of it is like almost as if it's supposed to be this way.
Yep.
Like, what else do I expect? Wow. And the reason that I can continue to move on is because God abides with me. Suffering happens because people have, they have free choice and they can do what they want, but it impacts me. And the only thing that I know, what I know is that God is with me. That's why I'm able to get out of the bed, or that's why I'm able to kind of move on in life. But I believe that those that cause suffering, because God is a just God, there is going to be some answer to that.
Yeah.
And that's what I share with people, that those people that did that, whether they're saved or not, they're still going to have to answer to God. They're going to have some explaining to do.
Yes.
And I think that helps. I think that helps people in their times of suffering, and understanding that God did not do this to them. We were talking about why some don't help others, because some people really believe that, well, they did it to themselves.
Sure, absolutely.
I ain't got nothing to do with that. Where that's total contradiction of who God is. So suffering is hard. I always say there's all of these different theological reasons for suffering, and then there's Dr. J's reason, which is I just don't know.
Yes.
But I do believe that people who, especially people that have caused mass suffering, that they are going to have to answer to God. Now, I don't know about you. Well, I don't want to look at God and be like, had to explain why I didn't feed masses of people, or why I took health care away, or why I deported a 14-year-old honor student. I don't want to have those conversations. I'm really trying to get to that well done, good and faithful servant.
Yes.
I think that the death of a 90-year-old great grandmother who was able to watch all of her grandkids and children grow up and lay in bed and they sing Amazing Grace as she crossed over to the other side. That's although it's painful for the family, not minimizing the pain of the family, but that's kind of a alley-oop. That's an easy one. So let's talk about dealing with death and eschatology in the context of a murder, be it by another person of color, a black person, or by law enforcement, or by systems and structures. And I think that's where the difficulty comes in. How do I reconcile and say it was God's will for the police to shoot a 16-year-old in the back, which we know that has been the history of policing in America, and almost every riot in America, or multiple riots in America, have started because police shooting somebody in the back. Vernon Johns even preaches a sermon about that in Montgomery, where he says it's still safe to kill the N-word, that there's a season of, you got to have a license to kill other animals, but you can kill the N-word without, but anyway, so this whole issue of what I like to label as escapism is I don't want to deal with the systems and structures that were the impetus for this happening. So what I'll do is I'll put it on God. This was God's will. If God didn't want it to happen, He wouldn't allow it to happen. And and not to diminish the omnipotence and omniscience of God, but I think that when some people get to heaven, wherever they're gone, and they've been murdered, God's like, "What you doing here? This wasn't my plan for you. This wasn't my goal for you." And so I think that oftentimes we miss the opportunity. And me being, in that black prophetic tradition, everything to me is black and prophetic. I mean? I don't care what it is. We're gonna hear some prophetic preaching. Is that we miss the opportunities to address in a public nature the injustices that we face. No, the kid that gets killed by the police running or gets shot in the back or whatever it is, they get killed because their headlight was out. There needs to be a prophetic response to that in a communal setting, that the community needs to know that this was not God's plan. This is the manifestation of evil, and not just an act of this kid running from the police, but this is built on stuff that's been happening since 1619.
And to call it out.
There you go. Call to name it. To name it.
Sometimes I wonder if that's why I don't get more preaching engagements. Because I'm going to call it out often, right? Yeah. Because people are so quick to blame things on God. That's God's will. How on earth could that be God's will? Yeah. But if you think it's God's will, then that excuses you from any responsibility or any solution or being a part of anything that is that's proactive.
Sure. And a black kid getting killed by the police is much more than that act. I mean, we're talking about multiple systems that play. The overpolicing of black and brown neighborhoods, the commodifying again of the prison system, the criminalization of black and brown bodies. I mean, you have a whole lot of other things. This was not one incident. This is not singular. This is a part of a massive issue, and those issues need need to be addressed. And so I think, again, at deaths that take place at the hands of violence, not only police, but even black, the crimes that are committed by black people against other black people. And I hesitate to use black on black crime because that's white on white crime. And we know that crimes, in particular murders, are often based on proximity and relationship, and that FBI studies show that white people kill more than white people than black people killing black people. But even in that, let's talk about what led up to this. This is not a singular act. This does not happen in an envelope or apart from everything else. And so we talk about poverty, we talk about lack of education, lack of access to resources. And at the end of the day, and I thought about this as I was driving over, what gives people hope beyond the grave as it relates to just getting to heaven? If I can just get to heaven, it'll be nihilism. We're nihilistic. We have no hope that our lives matter, that our lives belong in this matrix of the hypocrisy of democracy in these yet to be United States.
Wow. I could talk about this stuff for hours, and I really, Jay, your comment about, I don't have the answers, and I pastored a small inner city Baptist church a few years ago. And it was a small church, but over half the parents in that church had buried one of their children. Okay, I mean, and so you're talking about the impact of these broader systems.
Yeah.
So anytime that congregation was having to deal with death, there's a bigger context to it that makes their grief so complex. And we don't have a sort of singular answer to that. But I know how hard it was for me that the last funeral at that church was the suicide of a 19-year-old.
Yeah.
Because it's hard for people to make sense of the hell slavery and racism has created for black people to live in. Some of them find the strength to soldier it and make it to the end, and some don't. As a matter of fact, a lot of people don't make it.
Yeah. I think some of that has to be our own responsibility in that, being a Christian comes with some responsibility. It comes with some work. It comes with some compassion. I was asked to do a funeral once of a young man who nobody wanted to do the funeral because he was on the sex registry. Well, when they came to me, I was like, let me do the research, see what's going on. And it was really like a Romeo and Juliet thing. It was the age difference of less than a year. It's just the way the law was. But people were actually turning away the opportunity to minister to his family or to those behind without even doing the work. So I say that to say is I think that sometimes we say we're a Christian, but we're not doing the work of a Christian. It's like that saying, being I can go stand in the garage, that doesn't make me a car. Sure. Right? It's that, and so the way I am as Jay, I would love for Sunday morning not to be the most segregated time. I would love for there to be some kind of reconciliation here on this side. As days go by, my hope for that lessens. Yeah. But because I believe in a loving, just God, I do believe that God is going to hold people accountable. Yep. There's going to be, I don't know if it's called purgatory, I don't know if it's the waiting room, I don't know what it is. But at some point, they're going to have to answer to God for what they have done.
Yeah. And when Jesus responded to Zacchaeus, when Zacchaeus said, half of everything that I have, I'm going to give to the poor. And if I've wronged anyone, I will repay 4 times as much. Jesus says, this day has salvation come to this house. So salvation came because Zacchaeus was willing not only to give to those who were less fortunate, but to also, you can't pay back people you've wronged without first facing them. And he was willing to face them to pay them back. That means I'm going to acknowledge. So to me, going back to what Dr. Pramik said about this image of, before we get to the marriage supper and this great banquet, we're going to need, Miroslav Volf describes it as social reconciliation that's going to happen before the final judgment. That there's going to be space between now and before God makes all things new, where there's going to be a reckoning. We're going to face each other. There's going to be healing, justice, and reconciliation, and so that heaven can really be heaven. And so that's a snapshot of this vision that I'm putting before the church.
Right. Apart from the work that you're currently doing in your new piece, what substantive change? And I'm just thinking about this, that I'm even going to go back and look at it. What substantive change does the white evangelical church, primarily in America, but what substantive change do they believe is going to take place between now and heaven that will make this racial reconciliation a reality, where color, creed, gender is irrelevant? Because, I mean, is it a belief that once we die, then all of a sudden this stuff becomes irrelevant and magically just disappears? Or is it, and I know it's not going to be any substantive work to be done on this side, because power never gives away power. But it's just interesting that as we talk this through, to think about how I guess the belief is that when we die, everything will just be made right.
Yeah, they don't have a theology for this. They don't have a theology. God does it by divine fiat. Basically, what Jesus has done fixes all of this.
So I'm not a racist. I'm a racist on this side. I'm a bigot on this side. But when I die and go to heaven, all that stuff just goes away.
They've created a theological system that functionally allows them to not do anything substantive about that. So what I'm calling out is the theological system that allows them to do that. That is bankrupt, and that is not the gospel. And that mocks God. So as folks are having all these debates about are folks going to be eternally punished, or is everybody going to be saved? The conservatives are saying God is holy. God can't. It's the sin issue, and the only person who solved the sin issue was Jesus, and the only way to get the sin issue solved is is through Jesus, and then you will be justified, made right before God. Well, the progressives are going to say, no, God is love, and the loving God's not going to damn folks for eternity. As a black person, I'm saying, what if we start the conversation with God is just? Because both the love, holiness dichotomy has God ignoring what happens to folks in history. And when I read the New Testament, Jesus, when he's talking about how God metes out judgment, Jesus talks about what happened in history, what you did in your life. That matters. And even when Paul in 2 Corinthians 5:10, that says we must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ to give an account of what's done in the body, whether good or bad. That the reckoning is for both, good and bad. And so if God is just, then there must be some kind of reckoning for these things. We must face that to move towards a better future. So I see it as a way to completely disrupt and challenge, but it does leave us with something that's holistic, that I believe that a part of Christ's salvific work is reconciling all of this, and that God will be able to reconcile us.
This is probably going to sound very sophomoric, but I am one of those people that believe that God is just this amazing, loving God. But I also believe that God is a just God.
Yeah.
And so this is how I see it in my mind. When my children do something that they're not supposed to do, I love my children. But when they come to me and they have to stand before me and I know what they did, the disappointment that comes over them is overwhelming. And so in that way, I'm being just. I still love you, but there's going to be a consequence. But sometimes the consequence in itself is how low they're feeling in that moment. And so in some way, I see some of that happening, that you go before God and you're like, oh, wow, yeah, I messed up.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Because I mean, there are places in like Revelation where it talks about wiping tears from your eyes, and then saying, okay, now there's going to be no more tears. So then there must be space for that. It's appropriate once we finally have our eyes open, when we can have a moment that's free from the dominion of racial sin, because we all live under it.
Sure.
Where we finally get free from it, and we can see each other, and when you, and I'm sure when we see God, we're gonna know what really matters.
Oh, yeah.
That we face people we could have done right by. That it is appropriate to feel that.
Sure.
That you know, and so I have a chapter on reimagining divine judgment. That if we think about judgment has a broader telos, a broader purpose, that even judgment can be salvific. You know, and so I've had fun. My last question, and we're done. What are your biggest questions or struggles when you think about the afterlife? Because, I mean, Carlton Pearson wrote a book, and I mean, it created a firestorm. And the reason he wrote the book is because he was sitting at home one night after he'd been preaching, and I mean, he had a very successful ministry. Okay, you don't get a T.D. Jakes without Carlton Pearson inviting him to Azusa to preach behind closed doors. But he saw suffering African children in Rwanda who were dying. And because some of these children were Muslim, his theology at the time says those kids are going to go to hell. And it created a crisis for him, because he was like, they're kind of already in hell. They're living their lives in abject poverty. They are starving to death. And now because they're in the wrong religion, they're going to end up in hell. And so instead of, I think, church leaders trying to engage and have conversations, I mean, he was renounced by the African American College of Bishops. And he, you know, later embraced what he called, you know, the gospel of inclusion. But I think the black church's refusal to even give space for those questions radicalized him. That he may have been able to stay within the confines of the church if enough folks would say, man, I kind of struggle with that too. But man, they was almost as if to even ask that question was an anathema.
Sure.
Which what caring person doesn't say that is problematic? Gandhi's in hell. Like, I mean, that would, I mean, that's kind of problem. We can't even admit that in the church. That it's why it has taken me so long to write the book, because there is some risk.
Absolutely.
You're trying to get excommunicated, man. Hey, listen, you're along with King. I mean, the argument is that Gandhi
get you in trouble.
More of a Christian than most Christians. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, and those are harsh realities that we have to wrestle with. Leonard Ravenhill, I just posted this morning, talks about how, you know, oftentimes we are in love with the Bible more than the God of the Bible.
Yeah.
We are more in love with the Word of God than the God of the Word, and it almost makes the Bible, into an idol. And so I think we often get this. We can quote the Scripture, but we don't understand the heart of it and the heart of God. And so I think that any,
That's a great point, Doc.
any justice-loving person, they have to wrestle. They have to wrestle. I mean, my transformation from traditional conservative Baptist to wherever I am today, the liberal. I guess I'm the liberal in my.
I'm a recovering fundamentalist. you know, I can tell you the days.
You know that those questions have to be wrestled with. I mean, the manifestation of religion. You know, that one common theme amongst every community of people throughout the history of the world was that they all had some type of religion. How would that religion look? And so because people in India, China, Africa, Native Americans, because they didn't know about Jesus, are they going to hell? I mean, that's really what we're reducing God to. That's what's going on. To have this narrow, myopic perspective of what a relationship with God looks like and how it manifests. And so, I wrestle with those questions as well.
Okay.
And I think that for me, at the end of the day, I try my best to live according to what I believe the God of the Word and the Word of God says, and not let God figure the rest of it out.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
See, as you get to know me, I'm one of those bleeding hearts. Like, I just love everybody, right? And so in my
Oh, you're a Christian.
right? My theological imagination, at some point, everybody meets Jesus. I mean, I do. And I believe that is the way to heaven. And whether you're Muslim or whatever, I mean, my mother is Jewish, that at some point, God presents God's self. And you get that amazing opportunity where you can't even deny who God is. It's just like this beautiful moment that I imagine. And so the idea of somebody who is Muslim or Buddhist not going to heaven, I just can't. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense for me. I think where my sadness comes in, and maybe I'm wrong, but the fact that I have a relationship with God on this side is what has allowed me to wake up every morning, and what has allowed me to experience memories with my family, or to be grieving and feel like somebody is actually holding me in that moment. That relationship that I have with God now that others don't or may not have, that is what saddens me.
Okay.
But I still think that if you yeah, I just can't see a God that just like, nope, you didn't believe me. That's kind of egotistical. Like, you weren't my friend, so you can't come, I just think there's going to be this opportunity where they say every knee shall bow. I just really believe there's going to be this opportunity. And that's my hope. And I could go be wrong, so I ain't taking no chances.
Right.
I'm a believer now. And
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty, that when we're doing theology, it's not God talk. We can't speak for God.
Sure.
no idea.
But we get to give witness. I always tell my students that your theology can be coherent and consistent, but it needs growing edges and unresolved areas, because you can't wrap your little mind around an incomprehensible God, and the arrogance behind thinking you can describe God on a sheet of paper or in a book. That is absurd. Sure. When God shows up in a whirlwind to Job, like, you're gonna counsel me. Okay, so I'm not doing theology as if I'm God. I don't want God showing up in a whirlwind saying, "Let me ask you some questions." I'll be like, "No, please don't," because I don't have your mind. But
I think landmarkism has messed a lot of us up, and I think that oftentimes black churches didn't even realize they were doing landmarkism. If you don't believe what I believe, you're going to hell.
Yep.
And I think you brought up just a humongously valiant point. How can one individual or even a system of doctrines describe the bigness? I don't even have another word to use.
Yes.
Just the bigness
Yes,
of God.
man, yes.
God is just too big.
Yep.
And I think even for the Bible to contain who
Exactly.
God is.
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's one of my favorite concepts from my pastor, Dr. Derek Miles, man. That comes from the Black
mind
church.
can't
The
imagine.
bigness of God.
It's of God.
Bigness of God.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you all for your vulnerability and honesty, your heart, as well as your incredible minds that you brought to this conversation. It means the world to me to engage with church leaders about these not just future issues, but these important issues for the nature of the work that God has called us to in the here and now. So thank you so much for your time. And until next time, you all be blessed.